In this video, I'm going to be taking a picture of a figure that was taken over a screen, which you can see the original one here, and I'm going to be putting that over a background of out in the woods and reconciling the lighting between the two. So this was lit as flatly as I could in the given situation. It's not the best background for it, it's not even the ideal lighting for it, but this is a good starting point to create and manufacture my own light in a given scene. So you can see a couple of changes that I made even between this and the other version. If I toggle it here, you can see that I cut out and I replaced some of the hair just using a brush. It's not my best work, but it'll be good enough to get by with, especially because I anticipate this being a darker image. You can still see there's some of the background left up here. I'll deal with that as is necessary because I expect much of that to be shrouded in shadow as well. And you can also see that I removed quite a bit of these lights using a clone stamp from the face. So little things that I wanted to make adjustments to before I really got into the meat of this, because I want this to be about light rather than about cutting figure out from a background, which I handle in other videos, or using the clone stamp or something like that. So to save time, I went ahead and did that, but just tried to clean that up to give myself a more even space to work. Obviously this lamp is going to offer up some light, and it doesn't have any right now, so that's going to be entirely manufactured, and I want to make sure that manifests realistically, or at least close to realistically, on the figure. So here's the background that I put in, and you can see both of these are daytime. That's not really ideal for this situation. I need to switch that over to night, and the easiest way to do that, first off, is just to put a solid color over top of it. In fact, I think I'll use this existing one that I have here, and I'm going to switch the color over to a very dark blue, not quite fully saturated though. I'll set that to multiply, and then drop the opacity to give myself a significant darkening effect. I might actually increase that saturation just a little bit. Decide exactly where I want it. Somewhere right there. Obviously now the figure feels completely separate from the background, not remotely close, so I need to make some changes to that and get this figure starting to feel like the lighting situation in the background and on her are at least akin to one another. I'm going to start this off with just a curves layer directly above the figure, clip it to the figure using a clipping mask, and then just start to increase those shadows. You'll notice also that when you take a curves layer and you darken down like this, it tends to increase the saturation as well, or in the very least it maintains the saturation in a way that is not natural looking. So I'm going to take that darkening effect and add to that a hue and saturation, and just pull down the saturation a little bit and clip that to the figure as well. To make sure I'm getting the effect I want, I'll toggle that off and on, and it definitely looks like it's helping to drop that saturation some, so I'll leave that there. Now I'm going to take the curves layer and the mask attached to it, and using a soft brush, I'm just going to brush out some of that darkening effect on some of the area I know is going to be hit by the light from this lantern. So I'll probably drop the opacity of my brush down to about 20%, and then go in and just start putting some of that light back into the scene, back onto the figure. That means I'll get some on especially the outside of this headdress. Some of the inner areas are still going to be pretty dark. Some of it on these leaves that hang over more than others. I'm not going to be super precise here, rather just thinking in general terms. Put some light back onto the cheek and the eye. I still want that nose to be casting some shadow, but I have to be really careful to use larger, softer effects with the brush to keep there from being so many harsh, strange looking lines, which is very easy to make the mistake of doing. So Right now I feel like that even might be a little too intense, so I'm going to play with the opacity of the whole layer. Make sure to add some light everywhere that we're going to get some effect. Perhaps a little less down towards the bottom of the frame since it's just a lantern, but still some there. And already even you can see a significant difference here in the way that the figure starts to look like they belong in the scene. That's particularly important. I'm also going to brush out. There's a little bit of detail to be seen on this darker cardigan, so I'm going to brush some of that out as well. See if I can bring out a little bit of the detail. I'm not seeing a whole lot though. It's not a huge difference. First I'm going to deal a little bit with the background, because when I'm reconciling this light, the way I took the photo was to make sure that there was a backlight coming down from the behind and to the right of the figure herself. So that means that you have some light here along the knuckles and such that isn't going to be explained by the light from the lantern, which wouldn't create that feeling. So we're going to have to make sure that there's a second light source outside of it, and it would make sense that that would be moonlight. So I'm going to take above my color fill layer here, and I'm going to create something of some moonbeams. And I'm going to give that effect of this light kind of pouring through the back of these trees. And so I'll create these little rays, and it's best if they're kind of different thickness, different weight, different spaces from each other. One of the mistakes I typically make is to make them too heavy, too much, when they should be more dynamic. They should have some variation. That's why it gives the best result, the most realistic result, when you look at light as it streams through organic things like trees, like clouds. There's variation in the size of those beams. And so I want to give some sense of that in this image. Now I'm using the polygonal lasso tool to create this, which is probably the best for it. And in fact, I'll put some on this side as well, just to make sure. Much of this is going to get erased, but at the same time, I want to make sure that, for the most part, it's still there. So now I'm going to use Edit and Fill. Select a color. It's not necessarily the color that I want. Let's try that again. Edit and Fill. Choose color. And I'm going to use something very light blue. There we go. Now when I hit Command D to deselect, I have all these beams and light. It clearly doesn't look good right now, but I can use Filter, Blur, and I'm going to use a Gaussian blur. Set to, I rather like the look I get from about 48. Then I can use a blending mode such as soft light or perhaps overlay. Sometimes even screen. Screen's a little too intense for this situation though. So I'm going to stick with soft light. I'm going to drop the opacity a little bit. And then I'm going to use an eraser, or I could mask it, but in this case I don't mind losing a bit of it, so I'm going to use an eraser. And just kind of softly get rid of some of this that's a little bit closer. The computer's having to think about it some. I want that mostly to be in the background, so sometimes I'll go through and I'll create a little variation like through the middle there. Maybe along the top, as though these are not all equal strength, but rather they're being affected by their environment a little bit more. So something like that. I've got a sense of moonbeams through the trees. I might even image adjustments, hue and saturation. I want to make those a little bit more towards a warmer blue, kind of like that. So that's a significant difference there. Okay, so that gives me the excuse now, with these placed in the background, that there could be some bluish light that lands on the hand and maybe along the top of the headdress as well. So that's going to be my goal getting there, but right now I'm going to focus on the figure and this lamp, putting those elements together. Just to give myself a sense of where I'm starting from, I'm going to build first the bleed. I'm going to call this lamp bleed. This will be that larger color that stems from it. It's going to be very warm. In fact, I'm going to use the mouse a little here. This will typically overdo it, and I'll have to back it off some, but I don't want to use a blending mode, I don't think. Rather, I want to keep it just kind of standing there. Now it goes to the core of that light, so I'm going to do lamp core. I like to do these in separate layers. And with this core, I'm going to get a little bit more intense and a little bit closer. So really kind of build that up inside of the lantern. And add to that with maybe some brighter yellow variation in there, all the way up to something that's nearly white. That's my real core to the image. If you build a light in stages that way, it tends to look a lot more natural. It has multiple parts to it, not just simply a glow, but a general bleed and then also a core that goes along. I'm also going to add to it a larger bleed as a third part. This one I'm going to go back to the orange. Make that one kind of a much bigger color that comes off of it. Set that to overlay. That way you start to see that effect stemming from the lamp even further. So just trying to make that transition gradual, from light to no light, from color to no color, so that it feels as natural as I can possibly make it. Now let's really work on the figure. I'm going to apply a solid color for purposes of shadow, just like I did over the background. But probably not with the severity that I did to the background. I'm going to keep this one a little bit more subtle. I just want to make sure that there are some dark shadows to really sell my concept here. So, got my figure there. Shadow makes a big difference. It's very heavy. And I'm going to do kind of like I did with the curves layer before, but I'm really going to want to be careful as far as brushing out some of these shadows. I'm going to drop my brush to 10% opacity in the hope that I do not overdo this, but it is still extremely easy to take it too far. The difficult thing is just making sure that it still feels like natural transitions in light, and that is certainly difficult to do in Photoshop. It's just difficult to do artificially. So in the best case scenario, I would pull out some reference photos, stuff like that, to really help me get the light down, but for this tutorial I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and do the best I can with what I have. Definitely going to get a lot of light there on the edge of the hair. So we can expect that. It's going to be very bright on the face, but still some shadow cast by the nose in this very soft glow. Some light to the body itself. Again, trying to keep it subtle, trying to keep it soft. If I overdo the transitions, it really damages everything. We're going to have some light that comes up on these fingertips especially. So those are going to stand out a little bit more. I like to toggle it, kind of see where I'm at. I'm imagining this is an extremely soft, sort of fantasy style lighting. That gives me some leeway to have it not look completely realistic, but I still need it to have a logical relationship. I still need it to make sense. Need to soften that shadow there just a bit. I do want that shadow from the nose, but from the way this is positioned, it would still cast enough light that it's not a harsh shadow. And then a bit more on the leaves here. Some of these individual leaves that I want to stick out some, I want those to feel like they're catching some light, even if it's not an enormous amount. Some of the hair there as well. I'm also going to throw on a curves layer that does quite a bit in the way of brightening. I'm going to invert that mask and then paint it in little by little using white on some areas like the eyes where I feel like it needs just a little bump up, so that we can make out that detail. So if I toggle that, you can see they get considerably darker, and I just want that little bit of extra bump. Now in terms of some of that bluish light, I'm going to go ahead and add some of that rim light to it. With a hue and saturation layer. This is one of several ways to do it. I rather like this technique though. I'm just going to colorize the entire image with this hue and saturation. Make it blue to match the moonlight. Up that saturation a little bit. Drop the lightness a little bit. Now I'm going to do the same thing, invert it with Command I, and then paint some of it back in on these rim-lit areas. I do want to make sure that is clipped to the figure though, as that's going to make it considerably easy to paint some of that blue in here. That starts to give the feeling that some moonlight is catching on the figure and explains away that rim light that was really a consequence of me needing to separate the figure from the background during the photo shoot. So again, I might see some of that up along the edges of some of this foliage and such, especially up here on these flowers that are colored in a way that would probably catch the light. But that moonlight is going to be overpowered by the lamp itself. Above this hue and saturation now, actually in this case I might, oh no, I can do it above. Sorry, I'm just thinking through this. I'm going to put in a selective color and clip it. And I'm really going to warm up the skin on the figure right now, so I'm going to jump to the reds and pull out some of the cyan. Warm that up some. Bring in a little bit more yellow so that it looks like the lamp is influencing it. As you can see, if I toggle, it just adds a little bit of warmth there. Maybe drop that magenta just a bit. Trying to not lose the richness of the skin tone, but at the same time wanting to push it more towards that yellowish orange that I have. And I think that does the trick. Alright, now with the lamp, just to take this a step further, I'm going to create a new layer, and this is going to be lamp beams. And to keep this from being quite as soft, quite as much of a glow, I'm going to try to add just a little bit of realism to it in terms of how a camera would perceive this light, and you would probably see some rays of light coming from it. So this is sort of a lens flare, but not quite the whole thing. It's more like a part of it, something to contribute to what you're seeing. You might also just see this effect naturally if there's a lot of fog around or something like that. That's not quite enough, so I'm going to hold shift and just add to this a little bit more. Same thing of edit and fill. As far as color, I'm going to go somewhere towards this very, very light yellow. I'm going to give it the same blur treatment, which is going to cover quite a few of my mistakes, honestly. Decide how much I want to push it. And then I'm just going to leave enough of it on here that you can just subtly make out some of the beams. It also boosts the light itself just a little bit. Maybe even I've still got it a little too high there. Soft light's probably better. That gives me some variation of color in the background and such as those beams kind of stretch across and just sort of touch and manipulate the background some. We'll throw on a bit of a vignette. Not really to use on the upper part of the image, but rather the lower. As you can probably tell, I'm sort of playing this by ear, which is really what you have to do with these larger projects anyway. Just looking at it and trying to evaluate what it needs. It's actually doing quite a bit of thinking. That just adds a little bit of shadow down towards the bottom of the frame, pushes the eye upwards naturally towards the better lit parts of the image. Most importantly here, the face. This is usually also where I kind of kick back and look at it and try to figure out what else I want to do, what else does it need. etc. In this case, I think I'm going to go ahead and start doing some overall effect to it. Actually, there is one more thing I'd like to do. Create another solid color, make this one completely black, rasterize that layer. I'm going to name it lens flare, and I'll add, using Photoshop's rendering, something that at least resembles a lens flare. Their lens flares are not great, but they're also not terrible. That's general area of where it's at. I'm probably going to have to shift it around, I know. See, it's a little higher. Obviously don't want it to be that intense. In fact, I want it to be significantly lighter. Just needs a bit of a boost. And that allows some of these extra little spots and such to spread throughout the image. Now I'm going to take everything that I've put together so far, I'm going to dump it into a folder. We'll call that main. I'm going to duplicate it, merge that one, duplicate that again, take those two, put them in a folder, name that folder sharpen. This is a sharpening method that I've shown in other videos before. Take the top image, invert it, set that one to blending mode vivid light, set the folder itself to overlay, then select that top layer and do filter, blur, surface blur. I'm going to be looking, I think, for 7-8 pixels of sharpening, which is what this blur will help me accomplish. And that gives it a very high detail and also a high fantasy look. So I set it to 8 pixels. That gives me the look that I want. And then I go in on top of that and do some other effects as well. General curves, these types of things that bind something together. So after I've pieced it all together, I go in and I create effects to bring the elements together even more. That's brightening it just a little too much. I'm looking to just soften up those blacks some. Not a lot, just a hair. Do a little bit of toning. Bring some blues into the shadows. You'll hear this called often split toning, but it can mean quite a few things. It ages the photo some, which I think is helpful. This I'm unsure if I want to do, but a lot of times I'll take a solid color for a forced color harmony, and I'll just generally add it for a little bit of warmth. It's a little too much orange for my taste. And then I have to decide if I like it, if it's heavy-handed. In this case I like it, I just don't think I need very much at all, probably 5-6% opacity. Yeah, just a touch. That kind of warms up the image. Makes it work for me a little better. Now obviously this is not a detail driven finished image. If I look in close, you can see I didn't even clean up the edges. There's a couple of pixels worth of stuff around the edge of the figure. Definitely didn't do it with the headdress either, but I do notice some of that gray elements. You don't really notice them anymore. If I had a ton of time on my hands, I'd go in there and clean it up, get it perfect. In this case, I don't think I really need to. The distance that we've made from the original image until now, which let me bring that original piece in here. From that photo to this, it's a pretty big leap. And that's the idea behind it, is being able to take a photo asset, something that is relatively flat, and you provide for it the lighting, the situation, treat it basically like a painter would a scene. And it will give you a control over your work that we never really had before. And so for a tutorial going pretty quickly, honestly, I think that turned out pretty well.